Hey, this is Greg. This is GMH Audio, and today I'm going to talk about my first ever guitar modeler, the Vox ToneLab. I'm going to revisit it and kind of review and demo it as if I was trying a new piece of equipment. And along the way, I'm going to give you some tips and sort of my approach to dialing in guitar tones in general. Hey, so what are we talking about today? I'm going to talk about the Vox ToneLab. This is a desktop guitar amp modeler from the early to mid 2000s. It's kind of their version of the famous Line 6 pod, back when it was shaped like a red kidney bean. I just thought I'd bust it out, kind of revisit it, see how it holds up, and look at it with 2021 vision and see how I think it sounds. This used to be the way I record guitar tones. When I was starting out recording, I would plug this into my Sound Blaster sound card and I was off to the races. It pretty much had everything I needed built in and way more than I had access to actually recording at the time. This is based off the same technology as their Valvetronics amps, the chrome face ones and the older and higher end blue face ones, and this is essentially that modeling technology in a box. What made me think to even bust this thing out? I haven't really touched it in years. This is actually my first ever guitar, and I recently busted this back out and totally redid it. It used to look like this when I first got it, your standard Strat Pack Affinity Squire. And when I was 18, I redid it a bunch and turned it into this good old upgraded Squire Strat. And now, I recently redid it again, and it is now this, a fun blacked out Super Strat. The only thing original on this guitar at this point is the body, and I don't really know if it's the same Squire I started on anymore in that sense, but it's my first guitar and I love it. And while I was revisiting old gear, I thought, why don't I revisit some of my early recording gear as well? So, this is how I used to get guitar tones back in the day. I'm going to try and dial some up now. I feel like I learned a lot since I last used this about what makes a good guitar tone, see what kind of sounds I could get, see if it holds up. So why don't we check it out? I'll go over the features of this thing. Let me show you what we got. Over here we have the amp section. We have this rotary selector with a bunch of different types of amps. They're named things like Black 212, Tweed 410, UK Blues. Then you have AC 15 and 30, which are actual Vox amps. And if you know a little bit about guitar amps, it's not that hard to figure out what they're alluding to with these names. Then we have a bunch of cabinets. A bunch of them match up to some of those combos. We have some Vox cabinets. Then we have some 412s. UK H30, UK T75, UK US V30. Definitely these T75 is a Marshall 1960 with the 75 watt Celestians. And this US V30 I would assume is a Mesa with vintage 30s. Those are very common cabs. And you could also turn the cab off, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. You got your standard treble middle bass, gain, presence, volume. You also have this VR gain, which I'll talk about in a second. See, one of the appeals of this thing back in the day, it has a tube in it. Now, does this tube actually do anything? I kind of think it's mostly for show. You see how it glows a little bit? That's not the tube glowing. That is an LED underneath the tube to make it look like it's glowing. But this VR gain is allegedly this valve reactor technology they have that uses this tube to drive it and give you actual tube tone in this modeler. And this VR gain is how hard you're pushing that part of the circuit. So we'll check that out a little bit later. We also have an effects section with a bunch of models of pedals. These are mostly things that go in front of the amp. We have boosts and overdrive, fuzz, compressor, and acoustic simulator, as well as modulations, chorus, flanger, phaser, tremolo, rotary, 3 different types of delay, 3 different types of reverb. You could obviously store a bunch of presets in this. Right now I have it in manual mode, which means the controls, just whatever they're set to, that's what it is. So why don't we hear some stuff? So let's check this thing out. This is the Vox AC30 model through the Vox AC30 cab. There's actually two versions, the AC30 and 15. This is the model of the top boost channel. I have all the amp controls set to around noon. And this is about usually what I do, dialing in any amp. Some amps are a little weird with their controls, but usually I'm going to set the EQ to noon right in the middle, not any boost or cut, and treat that as like the neutral starting point towards just the natural sound of the amp, and tweak from there. So already to me, I feel like I want to add a little bit of brightness and treble. Let's see what this VR gain does. So what I think's going on here is I think this VR gain is essentially how hard you're pushing the amp. Whereas the gain is maybe how hard you're hitting the front end. The VR gain is how loud it is, how that's going to be driving the tubes into power amp saturation. And this channel volume is really just a neutral volume control that will turn things up or down to balance your patches. So that's a really cool feature. I think it really leans into the tube thing, because that's a lot of the appeal of tube amps, is making them loud, driving them. So here you can kind of do that. So now I'm on the black 212. That to me sounds like a Fender Twin. I'm using the matching cab. I've got all the controls at noon. It's driving a little harder than I expected, but when I switched to this lower output middle pickup, it cleaned up a lot, which leads me to something else. Kind of touch responsiveness of something like this. It's actually pretty good. Like if I roll my volume back down, it'll actually clean up pretty nice, which is a lot of kind of the feel and the dynamics that goes into playing an amp. And I think they actually did a pretty decent job on this, even though the driven sound sounds like it's farting out a little bit. I'm going to try turning this VR gain down and see if that cleans it up. Not really. What about the regular gain? So there we go. To me, it sounds like a little thin, and when the lows start pushing, it kind of farts out and gets really muddy. Maybe with some more tweaking, you could dial something in, maybe try some different amp models. I'm going to go for something a little crunchier though now. So now I'm on this UK 80s model. If I had to guess, I'd say it's probably a Marshall JCM 800, and I'm running it through the what I assume is a model of a Marshall cab. All right, a little crunchy. I'm going to try putting a overdrive in front of this. They've got this Tube OD model that I'm going to assume is a model of a Tube Screamer overdrive. And I'm going to use that kind of as a boost, see if I can get this a little tighter and a little higher gain. So for this application on a Tube Screamer, I did what I would usually do, which is to turn the drive all the way down and the level all the way up, and kind of use it more as a boost. The Tube Screamer has kind of a high mid peak boost and a low cut. So when you push that into the front of your amp with a lot of level, you actually are kind of driving those frequencies in specific more, and it leads to a tighter, higher gain distortion. I'll turn that off. And with it, You can hear kind of the nose on that when I palm mute with it off. So it's definitely doing the thing. I'm going to push the gain a little higher on the amp. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere with some high gain tones. The low end is not as tight as I'd like it to be. I'm going to try one of the actual high gain amp models and see how that sounds. So now I'm on this US high gain thing. I assume that that is sort of a Soldano or maybe a 5150 type thing, and I'm running that through the V30 cab, which I believe is a Mesa type cab. Now, this to me is not quite doing the thing. It sounds kind of a little fizzy. The mid-range is not really full. It's not really there how I want it to be. It sounds kind of a little hollow and thin, but at the same time, the lows are a little muddy. And I feel like the lower and mid-gain tones on this were a lot more touch sensitive. They were a lot more responsive and felt good to me. This is not quite doing the high gain metal sort of thing. But that being said, I think there might be hope for this yet. As I said in another one of my videos, the kind of amp you're using is actually not near as important as the speaker you're using. And my guess is that these speaker models are probably not all that good. And I think if I actually put this to the off position and use a nicer cab sim in Pro Tools, I'll be able to get a much better sound out of this, and I'll have a lot more flexibility. So now I've pulled up this. This is GGD Cali Oversized. It's essentially a model of a bunch of different Mesa cabinets with vintage 30s done to a really high quality. And I pulled this up because I was using the vintage 30 Mesa model on the ToneLab. So let's make it an apples to apples comparison and try a nicer model of the same type cab. So I've now got on the ToneLab, I've got the cab setting switched to off. I'm really glad that they put that feature. It was actually made this way more future-proof than if that feature simply didn't exist. It's really simple, but much appreciated. So let's hear this now with a nicer cab sim. Oh yeah, so much better right away. Suddenly the mid-range is so much more detailed, so much more rich. The lows are so much more tighter. The high end is not fizzy anymore. The cab really makes such a difference and is such a simple thing. And all of a sudden this ToneLab sounds freaking fantastic. I'll just quickly bypass that and go back to the internal cab just for a quick A/B. So here's the ToneLab's built-in cab with just E-chord. And now the Cali Oversized plugin. That mid-range is so much better. It's mid-range I didn't even know this box had, but it was just being masked by a kind of crappy cab model. Now I'm going to go back to some of these other sounds and maybe try and dial in more of like a crunch sound, but with this nicer cab, and see if I'm a little happier with it. Definitely a lot richer sounding. I think the cabs in this thing honestly might be the weakest feature. The amp models honestly don't seem bad at all, but if you use the internal cabs, it definitely can kind of suck the life out of them. Here's kind of that Fendery sound I was having some trouble getting dialed in before. Already much better. So there you can see this thing's really actually pretty sensitive to touch, to volume knob adjustment. Without changing any settings on the box, I was able to go from a pretty spanky clean to a pretty full-on high gain distortion. And that's something that I find a lot of, even now, amp sims kind of struggle with getting right. So maybe it has something to do with the valve reactor technology. Maybe it has to do with it just being, a box with its own dedicated hardware input rather than using like a DI box with an amp sim. But it seems to honestly do that better than a lot of modern amp sims. So the last thing I want to do is put this in a little bit of context. I've got a kind of Marshall-y, crunchy sound dialed up on the ToneLab, running through Kali in Pro Tools. And I'm going to compare some other amp sims I have to the ToneLab and kind of see how it stacks up to some more modern offerings. And to keep things a little more fair, since I've gone on about how much the cab affects it, I'm going to disable the cab sims in these other amp simulators and use the Kali with this same cab for everything, just for consistency. Alright, so first up, I've got Amplitube. So I've got their version of a Marshall JCM 800. Again, all the controls set to around noon. I'm not necessarily trying to dial in the most awesome tone. I'm just trying to get something decent for a quick comparison. And kind of same thing on the ToneLab. Here's what it sounds like, just for some reference. And now let's hear Amplitube. So first impression, they're definitely in the ballpark. They're definitely sort of a similar thing. I definitely hear some more interesting mid-range in Amplitube. That sounds maybe a little cloudy on the ToneLab. I'm hearing more of a distinct and more characterful mid-range. And the low end's a little fatter too. And that makes kind of sense to me. Mid-range, I feel like, is where amp sims struggle the most. So it makes sense that an older model would have a little bit more of a cloudy mid-range than a newer model. And I still think even some of the nicest amp sims still sound a little cloudy in the mid-range compared to a real amp. But I don't think the ToneLab sounds bad in this comparison at all. It's definitely the same sort of thing, the same sort of vibe. And with a little bit of tweaking of controls, I could probably get them really, really close. Now I've got up this Neural DSP. This is from their Nolly plugin, and this is also a JCM 800. Oh, that mid-range is even richer than on the Amplitube one. It sounds like it has some character. It has some kind of balls to it. I really like that. And let's switch back to the ToneLab to compare. Yeah, this to me is just sounding kind of muddy. I might tweak the controls a little bit, maybe take out some low end. Definitely still a lot happier with the Neural DSP. The kind of mid-range clarity and bite is just something I don't think I'm able to get out of the ToneLab. Now, this is only one amp model. It's got like 20 something. So, not saying all of them would have the same issue, but at least this JCM 800 is a little cloudy in the mid-range, and that's definitely an issue that I've had with amp sims in the past. Even this Nolly one that I like a lot, I sometimes feels a little cloudy compared to like a real amp. But that being said, it's definitely leagues beyond, and that makes sense. It's like almost 20 years newer than this Valvetronics technology. So it's cool to kind of hear the improvement in amp modeling right side by side. It does clean up if I roll off the volume knob. However, when I start to roll off the volume knob on this, it feels like I'm losing something. It feels less responsive, whereas the ToneLab actually feels really good with the volume rolled down. Feels more like a real amp, and that might have to do with, plugging in this box where it knows I'm coming in at a certain input level with a certain impedance versus going through a DI into a plug-in, but it just doesn't feel quite as good. So even though it sounds better, I like the feel of the ToneLab a little better. So where does that leave us? It was cool to revisit this. It's cool to see how far amp sim technology has come since this box. But in 2022, is this going to be a super useful tool in the studio? For my personal workflow, I probably will not be using it very much. Well, it does have some nice touch sensitivity and some nice responsiveness. The tactile control is nice. The sounds just are not up to par with what's available from sims these days, and even still real amps, which is my preferred way to work. That being said, I'm going to keep playing around with it, see what kind of sounds I could get out of it, maybe mess with the effects section some more, which we really didn't dive into too much, and maybe it can do some cool stuff that nothing else I really have can. Maybe it will be cool more as an effects box than a amp simulator. We'll see. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Hope you learned something, and if you didn't, hope you had fun anyway.